A snowstorm, a motionless dog at the door, and a secret buried for 27 years. The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the pines that surrounded Margaret Ellison's remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, piling against the windows until the world outside dissolved into a white void. Inside, the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Margaret, a wiry woman of 68 with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, sat wrapped in a quilt, her arthritic hands clutching a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Beside her, sprawled across the rug like a sentinel, was Shadow, her German shepherd, his black and tan coat glistening faintly in the firelight. For 12 years, he'd been her constant companion, her protector in this isolated corner of the mountains. But tonight, something was different. Shadow wasn't sleeping. His ears twitched at every gust, his amber eyes fixed on the door, and a low, restless energy pulsed through his frame. Margaret frowned, setting the mug down. "What's wrong, boy?" she murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. Shadow didn't bark. He never did unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he rose to his feet, padded to the door, and pressed his nose against the crack, a silent alarm ringing in his stillness. Margaret glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. The storm had hit earlier than the weather reports predicted, a monstrous blizzard that had already buried her truck under 3 feet of snow. She was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no cell signal and a radio that crackled with static. She'd weathered storms before, it was part of life up here. But Shadow's behavior gnawed at her. He wasn't pacing or whining, he was focused, deliberate, like a soldier awaiting orders. She pulled the quilt tighter, her heart thudding against her ribs. "It's just the wind," she told herself, but the lie felt hollow. Then, without warning, Shadow turned to her, his gaze piercing, and let out a single, sharp huff, a sound she'd never heard from him before. It wasn't a bark or a growl, it was a command. Margaret's breath caught. She didn't know what lay beyond that door, but she knew one thing, Shadow did. And whatever it was, it would change everything. Margaret hadn't always lived alone. 30 years ago, she'd been a schoolteacher in Denver, married to a kind man named Tom, raising 2 daughters who filled their home with laughter. But life had a way of unraveling. Tom died of a heart attack at 52, the girls grew up and moved away, one to Seattle, the other to Boston, and Margaret found herself adrift, drowning in a city that no longer felt like home. At 56, she sold the house, bought this cabin in the mountains, and traded the noise of civilization for the solitude of the wild. It wasn't an easy transition. The first winter nearly broke her, pipes froze, the roof leaked, and she spent nights shivering under blankets, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then came Shadow. She'd found him 12 years ago, a scrawny pup abandoned on a hiking trail, his ribs sharp against his matted fur. He'd followed her home, limping but determined, and she'd taken him in without a second thought. The vet guessed he was about 6 months old, likely dumped by someone who couldn't handle a German shepherd's energy. Margaret named him Shadow, not for his dark coat, but for the way he stuck to her side, a quiet presence that filled the emptiness Tom had left behind. Over the years, he'd become more than a pet. He was her partner, her confidant, her eyes and ears in a world that could turn hostile in an instant. He'd chased off bears, barked at rattlesnakes, and once led her back to the cabin when she'd gotten lost in a fog so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Shadow didn't just live with her, he kept her alive. Tonight, though, was different. The storm outside was a beast, its roar shaking the cabin's walls, but Shadow's focus wasn't on the weather. Margaret stood, her knees creaking, and shuffled to the window. She wiped the fog from the glass, peering into the swirling white. Nothing. Just snow and darkness, an endless void that swallowed the forest. She turned back to Shadow, who hadn't moved from the door. "You're spooking me, you know that," she said, half joking, but her voice trembled. Shadow huffed again, louder this time, and scratched at the wood with a paw, a rare sign of insistence. Margaret's stomach twisted. She trusted Shadow with her life, had done so for over a decade. If he was this agitated, something was out there. She grabbed her coat from the hook, a heavy parka patched with duct tape, and pulled on her boots. The wind slammed against the door as she cracked it open, snow blasting her face like shards of glass. Shadow darted out before she could stop him, vanishing into the storm. "Shadow," she shouted, her voice swallowed by the gale. Panic surged through her. He'd never run off like this, not in weather this bad. She grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, its beam weak but steady, and stepped into the blizzard, the cold biting into her bones. She didn't know where he was going, but she knew she had to follow. Shadow didn't act without reason. The snow was knee-deep within minutes, each step a battle against the wind and the weight of the drift. Margaret's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a chaotic swirl of flakes, but Shadow was nowhere in sight. "Shadow," she called again, her throat raw. The storm answered with a deafening roar, branches snapping somewhere in the distance. She stumbled forward, her breath ragged, fear clawing at her chest. What if he was hurt? What if she lost him out here? The thought was unbearable. Shadow was all she had left, the last tether to a life she'd fought to rebuild. Then, through the whiteout, she saw him, a dark shape against the snow, about 50 yards ahead near a cluster of pines. He wasn't running anymore. He was digging, his paws churning the powder with frantic precision. Margaret pushed toward him, her legs burning, the cold seeping through her gloves. When she reached him, she dropped to her knees, gasping. "What are you doing, boy?" Shadow didn't look up. His claws scraped against something hard, rock, not earth, and he let out a low whine, the first vocal sound he'd made all night. Margaret aimed her flashlight at the spot, her heart pounding. The beam revealed a jagged opening in the mountainside, partially buried under snow and ice, a cave, hidden from view until Shadow uncovered it. She hesitated, the wind screaming around her. Caves weren't uncommon in these mountains, but this one felt wrong. Too narrow, too concealed, like a secret the Rockies had kept for years. Shadow stopped digging and turned to her, his eyes urgent. He stepped into the opening, then looked back, waiting. Margaret swallowed hard. "You're crazy," she muttered, but she crawled after him, squeezing through the gap. The cold stone scraped her shoulders, and for a moment, she thought she'd get stuck. Then she was through, tumbling into a small chamber where the wind's howl faded to a distant moan. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the smell of damp rock and something metallic. Shadow stood ahead, his tail low, sniffing the ground. Margaret swung her flashlight around, her breath catching as the beam illuminated the cave's contents. Bones, human bones, scattered across the floor, some cracked and yellowed with age, others tangled in shredded fabric that might have been clothing once. A rusted canteen lay in a corner, next to a backpack so decayed it crumbled when she nudged it with her boot. And there, against the far wall, was a pile of gear, ropes, a broken ice axe, a faded journal half buried in dust. Margaret's hands shook as she picked up the journal, its cover stiff with frost. She opened it, the pages crackling, and read the first line, January 14, 1998, Day 6. "We're trapped. The avalanche sealed us in. God help us." Margaret sank to the ground, the journal trembling in her grip. 1998, 27 years ago. She remembered the headlines vaguely, a distant memory from her Denver days. A group of climbers, experienced mountaineers, vanished during a winter expedition in the Rockies. Search parties scoured the area for weeks, but the storm that year had been brutal, burying trails and hopes alike. The case went cold, the climbers presumed dead, lost to the mountain's unforgiving embrace. And here they were, or what was left of them, hidden in a tomb Shadow had somehow found. She flipped through the journal, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The entries were sporadic, written in a shaky hand that grew weaker with each page. January 15th, food's gone. Tom's leg is broken. We hear the wind, but no rescue. January 17th, Sarah stopped talking today. I don't think she'll make it. January 20th, I heard barking outside. A dog? Maybe I'm losing it. Please, someone find us. The final entry, dated January 23rd, was barely legible, too cold. Too tired. If anyone reads this, tell my wife I love her. David. Margaret's throat tightened. David. Tom. Sarah. Names of people who'd fought to survive, who'd clung to hope until the end. And that barking, could it have been real? Shadow nudged her hand, his nose cold against her skin. She looked at him, her mind reeling. How did you know? She whispered. He whined again, softer this time, and pawed at the ground near the bones. Margaret followed his gaze, spotting something glinting in the dirt, a metal tag, small and tarnished, attached to a frayed collar. She brushed it clean, holding it to the light. Engraved in faint letters were the words, Ranger, property of T. Marshall. A dog tag. Not military, but canine. Margaret's breath hitched. Had these climbers brought a dog with them? Was that the barking David heard? She sat back, piecing it together. The climbers must have been caught in the avalanche, trapped in this cave as the snow sealed the entrance. Their dog, Ranger, might have escaped, wandered the mountain, maybe even tried to get help. But no one came. And now, decades later, Shadow had led her here. Why? How? The questions swirled, but one thing was clear, she couldn't leave this place, not yet. These people deserved to be found, their story told. She tucked the journal and tag into her coat, her resolve hardening. We'll get them home, Shadow, she said, stroking his fur. But first, we've got to get ourselves out of this storm. Getting out of the cave was harder than getting in. The snow had piled higher, narrowing the entrance to a slit barely wide enough for Shadow. Margaret hacked at it with the broken ice axe she'd found, her arms aching, until the gap widened enough for them to crawl through. The storm hadn't let up, if anything, it was worse, the wind relentless force that threatened to knock her flat. Shadow stayed close, his body shielding her from the gusts as they trudged back to the cabin. It took nearly an hour, every step a fight against exhaustion and the cold that numbed her fingers and toes. By the time they stumbled through the door, Margaret was shaking uncontrollably, her coat crusted with ice. She collapsed by the fire, dragging blankets over herself and Shadow, who pressed against her side, his warmth a lifeline. For 2 days, the blizzard raged, trapping them inside. Margaret kept the journal close, rereading it by firelight, memorizing the names and dates. She tried the radio again and again, but the static was impenetrable. Shadow stayed vigilant, his ears perked at every creak of the cabin, as if he knew their work wasn't done. On the third morning, the wind finally died, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Margaret bundled up, grabbed a shovel, and dug out the door, Shadow at her heels. The sky was clear, a piercing blue that hurt her eyes, and the snow stretched unbroken for miles. She knew what she had to do. With Shadow leading the way, she retraced their path to the cave. The entrance was still visible, though partially refilled with drift. She marked it with a stick, then headed back to dig out her truck, a grueling task that took hours. By noon, the engine sputtered to life, and she drove down the mountain, the journal and tag on the seat beside her. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away, a small outpost manned by a grizzled veteran named Hank. When she walked in, clutching her finds, Hank's eyes widened. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, turning the tag over in his hands. "Shadow found it," Margaret said, nodding to the dog at her feet. "In a cave, up near my place. There are bones, human bones. I think it's those climbers from '98. Hank radioed for help, and within hours, a team arrived, rangers, police, even a forensic expert from Denver. Margaret led them to the cave, Shadow guiding the way with the same quiet determination. The team spent days excavating, recovering the remains of 4 climbers, David Harper, Tom Marshall, Sarah Klein, and a 4th identified later as Michael Ruiz. The journal and tag confirmed their identities, and dental records sealed the case. But the real shock came when the forensic expert examined the bones and gear. "There's evidence of a dog here," she said, holding up a canine tooth. "Looks like a German shepherd. Probably died with them." Margaret's knees buckled. "Ranger. Tom Marshall's dog." She looked at Shadow, who sat calmly beside her, his eyes on the cave. "Did you know him?" she whispered, half expecting an answer. Shadow tilted his head, a gesture she'd seen 1,000 times, but it felt different now, weighted with something she couldn't name. The discovery made national news: lost climbers found after 27 years, dog leads woman to hidden grave. Reporters swarmed Willow Creek, cameras flashing as Margaret recounted the story, Shadow at her side. She kept it simple: the storm, Shadow's insistence, the cave. But the questions lingered in her mind, unanswered. How had Shadow known? Was it instinct, some primal sense of duty passed down through generations? Or was it something more, something tied to Ranger, the dog who died trying to save his people? She dug into the climber's story, piecing together their lives from old articles and family interviews. David Harper had been a geology professor, married with 2 kids. Tom Marshall was a guide, Ranger his trusted companion on every climb. Sarah Klein was a photographer, Michael Ruiz a student tagging along for experience. Their families had mourned them, held memorials, moved on. Now, they came to Willow Creek to claim the remains, tears mixing with gratitude as they thanked Margaret and Shadow. Tom's sister, Ellen, knelt beside Shadow, her hands shaking. "Ranger was Tom's shadow," she said, voice breaking. "He'd have done anything for those people. Just like your boy did for you." Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. That night, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire, Shadow curled at her feet. She pulled out the journal again, rereading David's final words about the barking. Then she remembered something, a story her father had told her, decades ago, about a German shepherd his uncle had owned, a dog named Scout who'd wandered off into the mountains and never returned. Her father had laughed it off, a family tall tale. But what if Scout had survived, found a mate, started a line that led to Shadow? What if Ranger's blood ran in him, too? The idea was fanciful, but it stuck, a thread connecting past and present. Weeks later, the Rangers installed a plaque near the cave, in memory of David Harper, Tom Marshall, Sarah Klein, Michael Ruiz, and Ranger, lost January 1998, found January 2025. Margaret attended the unveiling, Shadow beside her, his presence drawing murmurs from the crowd. Afterward, she took him on a walk, the snow crunching under her boots. "You're a hero, you know that," she said, scratching his ears. Shadow wagged his tail, a rare burst of playfulness, and bounded ahead, kicking up powder. Margaret laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened, not just by the storm, but by the solitude she'd carried so long. The months that followed were quiet, but not empty. Margaret started volunteering with the Rangers, training Shadow to assist in searches, a natural role for a dog with his instincts. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, became a hub of activity as locals stopped by, drawn by the story of the woman and her dog who defied a blizzard to bring closure to a decades-old mystery. Her daughters called more often, their voices warmer, hinting at visits in the spring. And Shadow thrived, his eyes bright with purpose, his bond with Margaret deeper than ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the snow gold, Margaret sat on her porch, Shadow at her side. She thought of Ranger, of the climbers, of the lives she'd touched without meaning to. "You saved more than me that night, didn't you?" she said softly. Shadow rested his head on her knee, a silent answer. She smiled, her hand tracing the scars on his ears, marks of a life hard won. The mountain had taken much from her, but it had given her this, a companion who'd seen her through the dark, and a story that proved even the smallest acts could echo through time. If this tale moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you hear a dog's silent call in the storm, listen, it might just lead you to a miracle. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications for more stories. Thanks.